Like I said, my name is William Gingold. I'm an old guy. And what I'll try to do is share with you a little bit about the Gingold family, at least the immediate family, during a very difficult time called the Holocaust, which was part of the Second World War. I'm not very tech savvy, so I hope I can move these slides along nicely. Anyway, just since it's hard to have a pointer on this kind of screen, we'll just play it by ear as to what's on here. That's kind of a very brief outline of some of the things. Can you hear me back there? Okay. Some of the things that I'll be touching upon. And one of the things I would really encourage you to do, if you would, is think of questions that you might want to ask me after I do a presentation with you. Because I'm more interested in the questions that you have and maybe trying to answer them than to do a kind of a dry presentation. So kind of think, most of you don't have paper in front of you, so you can't write them down, but think ahead of time what questions you will have as I'm talking, whether they're questions of just information, or you have some ideas about what I've said, etc. All of that is welcome, and I'll do the best I can to try to answer them where I can answer them. Okay, we got it? Okay. Okay, so let me start off with some very important, again, I'll take it this way. Okay, it's not doing anything exciting for me now.
Okay, you just want the next one? Okay. Oh, there it goes.
Okay. Those are my parents, or everyone that I'll be sharing information with you that's during this presentation is deceased. I'm the only survivor. So, but they're very important people in my being here. Okay? That's my mom and dad. My mom was about 5'1", 5'2". My dad was about 6'2" in height. And you can tell the height difference right in the picture. And the reason I introduce you to them, my mom never went to school. My dad had a 4th grade education. So he was an intellectual in our family, the educated one. And basically, these were very tough people. Very bright. When I say bright, they could think on their feet a lot. They could plan ahead. And one of the beautiful things about my parents is that they were risk takers, based on good problem solving and good planning ahead. Okay. So I'll move ahead. If you can
Yep, I got you.
do the next slide. What I want to do is just very briefly just hit upon the top heading there, the Jewish people. I'd like to share with you just some general comments about the Jewish people as a whole, and recognize your young adults that within any group of people you have a whole range of the way they function, the way they behave, etc. So you can't stereotype one group of people with the same behaviors. Anyway, one of the characteristics, let's call it, of Jewish people is that they have a strong commitment to equality and equity. They want to be treated just like you want to be treated. which isn't unusual. Okay? They also believe in one God in terms of their religious beliefs. In addition, the Jewish people's cultural heritage and values are carried on historically over a 3,000-year period to the current day. And different Jewish people practice and carry over these values and heritages to different degrees, just like any other group would. And finally, they believe in the Ten Commandments, and they practice them, just like other groups, to different degrees. But they have also an 11th commandment, and that's learning and education. And one of the reasons that the Jewish people have such a strong commitment to that is that when you learn something and you get educated, and I'm kind of using them synonymously, is that that's something no one can take away from you. They can take away your clothes, they can take away your food, they can take away your house, and they can even take away you as a physical human being. But what you have learned, no one can take away from you. So that's one of the underlying values that's been carried over by the Jewish people that's stressed almost universally, is learn as much as you can, get educated as much as you can. Okay? So let's move on to the next. Okay. Now, one of the things, if I had a pointer that works, is that why do we have holocausts or genocides? If you take that word on the top left, the word hate, that's usually the driver for most type of violence. And all these other words and behaviors and ideas feed into building hate. And by the way, this is just a limited list. There are many more factors that might feed into building hate in people. And once hate hits a certain threshold that's accompanied by violence, that's when it turns into a Holocaust. Okay? So I just want you to just think of it. What are different things that you can do that would negate or control or fight against these factors, such as bias, prejudice, scapegoating, etc., etc. And that's something, you have to work on for years and years. It's not an immediate thing. So let's try the next slide. Keep on going. Another one. Next one. Next one. Okay. I want to get into the meat of this that you might be interested in hearing. All of the people whose name I'll share with you were all born in Warsaw, Poland. Now, I don't know how many of you have studied geography of Europe or Poland, but if you listen to today's news, where Russia is trying to invade or has invaded some parts of Ukraine, a lot of the people that are fleeing Ukraine because of the damage being done to their country are fleeing to Poland. And a good portion of them stay in Poland, and particularly Warsaw, Poland, which was and is the capital of Poland. Now, just one comment about Warsaw. prior to the Second World War, Warsaw, Poland was a cultural capital of Europe in terms of music, theater, plays, etc. But I won't belabor that too much. Anyway, the war began September 1st, 1939. And just a short while after that, about a week, the German Nazi military forces start attacking Warsaw, Poland. Now, remember I mentioned to you that my parents kind of think ahead. So one of the things, particularly my father, was anticipating is that the Germans would attack Western Poland and move gradually towards the east to try to take over all of the countries there. And his thinking, and I think and his guessing, was correct in that that turned out to the plan that the Nazi regime had for conquering Europe first and then going after Russia or the Soviet Union at that time. Anyway, so keep that in mind, that my dad kind of had a future plan for us to escape Poland, particularly Warsaw. So anyway, the bombing started on September 1st, 1939, and on September 20th, I was born. Okay? And that's where I come into the picture. Good, bad, or indifferent, by the way. All right? And one day after I was born, remember my parents anticipated this, the hospital that I was in was bombed. So as soon as I was born, or my mom gave birth to me, my dad went to the hospital immediately and extracted or took us out of the hospital, anticipating that something is going to happen to Warsaw. So that was escape one. I was 1 day old. Okay. And then, as you can see, I kind of jotted down for you, Warsaw surrenders September 27th, which is, you look at when it was invaded to the day that it surrendered, it's only about 19 days, a week and a half. So the war, at least the conquering of Warsaw and Poland, was very short. And the reason was pretty simple. The Polish army, or the military, were on horses with pistols trying to fight the Nazi regime that had warplanes and tanks. So there was not a fair fight at all, and they surrendered very quickly. Next slide. This is a picture of the hospital maternity ward that my mom was in. All the high-tech stuff that you can see here, right? All right, let's move on. As it's being done in Ukraine with the Russian bombing, as soon as the sirens go off, people go into the basements because that's the safest place to be. At least you have a fighting chance of survival if your building gets hit. So the same thing happened in those days when the war started, when the Nazi planes started bombing the Poland and Warsaw. And that's just a picture of the maternity ward in the basement of that hospital. Okay, next slide. This is a picture one day later. The whole hospital has been destroyed. So all of the people that left the day before at least survived another day. Okay. Now I want to introduce you to a few other people that played a significant role in the Gingold family. Let me just take a drink. I apologize. If I don't do that, don't get enough fluid in my body where I have enough blood going to my brain, I'll faint. So, anyway, let's, Duvid is my dad's name. Leah is my mother's name. Chava was my aunt. She was about 16, 17 years of age at that time. So just a little bit older than some of you. Freund was my uncle. He was about 21 years of age. Sam was my older brother, who was about 7 years older than I was. And then my name was Baruch. That's a Hebrew word. It stands for bless you or be blessed. And one of the wonderful things about Baruch, if one reads Hebrew in the Old Testament, is that almost every sentence starts with Baruch. So I'm really famous going back thousands of years ago, okay? No, I'm just kidding. Okay. Anyway, so my parents anticipating what was happening to Warsaw and Poland, they tried to get the heck out of there. Not just the Gingolds, but thousands upon thousands of other people tried to escape from the bombing. And what they would do is try to go east, and east was where Russia was located, or the Soviet Union. And so the Soviet Union occupied part of Poland, eastern Poland, for quite a while. So all of these people that were fleeing were trying to get to the Russian military encampments to hopefully live another day. Okay, so that's what all of these people did. What they did is they, and by the thousands were on the roads leaving Warsaw, trying to go to the Soviet Union. And unfortunately, the people that stayed on roads wound up getting killed. And the reason happened is that German fighter planes would fly over these roads, and if they saw anybody on there, they would shoot them. So thousands upon thousands of people died trying to flee from Warsaw.
And these were families, right?
And we were part of that herd
Yep.
trying to leave. But we were fortunate again because my dad kind of anticipated this. My parents never talked to me about this, so I don't know his mental set as to why he was able to anticipate that. He moved the family, or my mom and my dad, moved the people that I identified for you either into the gullies to get off the road or into the woods. So that was our saving grace by not being on the road and potentially being killed that way. Well, we tracked with other families the same way. And by the way, I have to underline for you, look, played a big deal in anyone surviving the Holocaust, okay? Aside from maybe, all kinds of other variables that played into it. Okay, anyway, we wound up reaching the Russian encampment, military encampment, and lo and behold, when we reached them, they put us on trucks. And ironically, the trucks were German trucks, not Russian or Soviet Union trucks. And these trucks took us back to Warsaw. And the reason they did that, at that point in time, Russia and Germany had what was called a non-aggression treaty, which meant they wouldn't fight with each other or try to kill each other at that point. So basically, the Russians were honoring this non-aggression treaty by putting us on German trucks, and then the Germans took us back to Warsaw and put us in a kind of an area of Warsaw where the buildings were still physically intact, and eventually that area became what is called the Warsaw Ghetto. Okay. And just as a brief description, all of the Gingolds were provided with one room, and I'm sure that was also true for other people. It had no mattresses, bedding, no heat, no light. Everything had to be shared with multiple other families throughout this array of structures. Let's move on. Okay, here, I made it through 1 week. So far, so good. Okay. As we're living in this soon-to-be the Warsaw Ghetto, some of the Polish nurses come to try to help the people in that area. And one of the things out of those nurses, some of the nurses approach mothers of young children, particularly infants and toddlers, and say, your life here isn't going to be very rosy. That's not the words that they use, but it's not going to be very easy. The chances of survival is going to be relatively low. That's not my mother talking, is it? Okay. All right. The chances of survival will be relatively low. But what we're willing to do, or I am as a nurse willing to do, is see if I can take your baby and get your baby or young child adopted with a Christian family to increase the potential of survival for your child. Or smuggle your baby out of Poland to another country that isn't in a war situation, and try to save your child that way. So almost all the parents of young children were approached that way. And my mother declined the offer. She said, no, I'll keep me and the rest of the family together, and we'll do the best we can. So, but the other thing that I want to mention here, and some of my slides are kind of wacky and maybe out of place, is that in this area called Warsaw Ghetto, one of the biggest problems people had was starvation. They couldn't get enough food. And I'll come to that shortly and tell you a little bit about that. But one of the things that happen when you have a high rate of starvation is that you never know when the person is going to die. And as soon as a person died inside the building, all of their clothes were removed. And they took the naked body and put it on the street. And the reason they did that was part of longer-term survival, is that they needed the clothes, as an example. Let's say they can rip up clothes to make diapers for the young kids. They can use clothes and other things as part of maybe exchanging the stuff in terms of food, which was a critical need, etc. So just keep that in mind, that starvation was a major problem, and what people tried to do of staying alive. Next one. Okay, I want to talk to you a little bit about Warsaw Ghetto. Let's go to the next slide, that might be better. Okay. If you look at this big rectangle and kind of consider this as Warsaw, the city of Warsaw, which had a population of about 1.3 million people, which is a pretty big city, especially when you go back that many years. And 1/3 of the population of Warsaw were made up of Jewish people, about 400,000 of them. Okay, when the ghetto was being formed, the Nazis would force all of the Jewish people into an area where that little square is located. That gives you kind of a relationship between the Warsaw Ghetto and the rest of Warsaw in terms of geographic size. Okay, so on the big rectangle, about 2/3 of the people lived. In the small square, 1/3 of the population lived of Warsaw. Okay, that would suggest to you right away how crowded it was. And remember, and do I need to do anything for this? Okay, I'm good. Thank you. Okay, so anyway, that little square is the Warsaw Ghetto. Very crowded, very dilapidated, very few resources in there. Let's try the next slide. Before the ghetto was walled off, there was still a relatively reasonable exchange from the ghetto area to the rest of Poland, or Warsaw. And this is just an example. They had an open markets where you could get food by trading whatever you had. Let's move on. Shortly after that, the wall went up. And the wall was a huge wall surrounding that little square that I showed you, which, to give you a perspective of size, was about 1 square mile. In other words, 12 blocks by 12 blocks in size, that had between 350,000 to 400,000 people in it. You have how many people in Villa Grove? About how many?
2,500.
2,000?
Between 2 and 3.
Yeah, so
We're about
as
a square mile.
as an example, if we took all of the people from Villa Grove and divided this room in half, and we put all of the Villa Grove people in there, That's how the Warsaw Ghetto was stacked. I'm just making kind of an analogy.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact dimensions here. Okay, next slide. It was walled off. The laborers were all the Jewish people that lived inside the ghetto that wound up doing the wall. And let's move on. Okay. Now, once the wall was built, the Nazi military regime could control the space very easily. At one point, that ghetto area had 32 entrances and exits. Once the wall was put up, it had only 4. So they all had to do was control 4 entrances and exits for 400,000 people. Okay, what I want to highlight here, all of these are survival issues that the people in the ghetto face. The major one was starvation. That was the single largest contributor to people dying. About 2/3 of the people died from starvation. And to give you again a perspective on that, out of the 400,000 people in the ghetto, between 7,000 and 9,000 people, in other words, the size of Villa Grove population, died every day. And when they died, they were put out on the streets next to the buildings. And the reason I'm mentioning that is kids your age and younger played a major role in handling the people that died. So anyway, coming back to survival issues within the ghetto, the primary one was pretty much starvation, followed by disease, infection, because the whole place was unsanitary. There was very little medical care, etc. Some Jewish doctors worked in the ghetto, but unfortunately they had to deal with the same hardships as other Jewish people. So they lasted a little longer because they received additional food rations because they were physicians. Okay. So they were lucky on that part to live a little longer. And then there were all kinds of other reasons in addition to the brutality of the perpetrators. So let's move on. Next one. This is just a picture of some youngsters in the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, if you're very perceptive, you'll see one youngster smiling. Now, ironically, almost all of the pictures, all of the history of the Holocaust was recorded by the Nazis. So in all probability, all we can do is guess at this juncture, is that the German photographer who was taking pictures inside the ghetto said, "I want you to smile." And that's the only reason I can think of this youngster smiling. But there may be other reasons. Let's go on. Here is a youngster that is non-found. Well, it's hard to say, but is in terrible shape. And there are thousands upon thousands of these pictures taken by the Nazis. They actually documented the Holocaust. So any information that you see about the Holocaust, in all probability, was put together by the Germans. Next one. Some Jewish people tried to put together various kinds of efforts to try to keep people alive and mentally functioning inside the ghetto. Unfortunately, the Nazi regime did not allow any of that to happen. Okay. So if you were caught, as an example, having a religious service and praying to God, in all probability, those people would die. So it was very difficult to get any of this even organized, let alone functional. Let's move on. Okay, I told you I had an older brother. Okay. One of the things, once the Nazi ghetto was established, the adults and young people would be required to work. So the German authorities would pick up adults who didn't have very young children, and usually teenagers, usually 13 or 14, if they were of larger stature. Every morning, they put them on trucks and took them to manufacturing companies of the Third Reich so they could produce for the war effort for the Germans. So my aunt, uncle, as well as my dad, would be going to work, if you will, every morning, 7 days a week, from about 7 in the morning until about 6 or 7 at night. And then they would be brought back. And sometimes some people weren't brought back because they either died on the job. Remember, starvation goes with you wherever you are if you're not getting the nutrition. Other people were brutally killed in some fashion or another. I don't want to get into the gory stuff with you. That's not my intent here. Okay. Anyway, the kids under the age of what they picked up for slave labor to work became corpse collectors. Remember, about 7,000 to 9,000 people died a day. So they had to remove the corpse from this enclosed area. And these young kids, your age, the age of my brother, who was about 7 years of age, would be the people that would pick up these individuals that died in whatever fashion and put them on carts. And then the German regime would allow the carts to be removed from the encampment. And you can almost guess what happened to those corpses. One thing I am conjecturing is that they would be buried in mass graves. The other is that they would be cremated or incinerated. And that became a kind of a routine pattern. Well, anyway, the nurses kept on visiting, trying to talk parents into giving up their young children. Again, my parents decided not to do that. They have never told me, while they were alive, why they declined to do that, because they never talked about the Holocaust. Uh, let's move on to the next slide. And as you can envision, the living situation in the ghetto was getting worse and worse. So with the help of my dad and some other, maybe let's call them leaders for the time being, or risk takers, or gutsy people, whatever, descriptors that you might have, decided to try to escape the ghetto. So one of the efforts was made to go through the sewer systems of Warsaw, Poland. As I mentioned to you earlier, Warsaw was kind of an advanced city in Europe, whereby actually the sewer system was technically highly advanced. Okay. Anyway, they coordinated with other families in secret, usually after they were brought back from slave labor. My dad and others would meet to figure out risk levels, planning strategies, how do we escape. So they tried the tunnels. Unfortunately, these multiple family units, someone forgot to put the sewer grading down, so it stuck up. So when the German military patrols saw that, they immediately machine gunned into the sewers. So you can envision, kind of a little mentally, that you're in a very close quarter and somebody is shooting in there. Some people will get hit, others might not. We were fortunate, at least the Gingolds and other families, to be able to retreat and maybe try another day, another approach. So that was our second effort to try to get out of not only the Warsaw Ghetto, but out of Poland. Yeah. Unsuccessful, unfortunately. Okay, next slide. Anybody? Okay. This is a picture. Excuse me. This is a picture of a youngster, probably your age, and an adult, basically digging tunnels. That was an ongoing thing in the ghetto, was to dig tunnels between buildings and under the wall that enclosed the ghetto. My brother was also one of the diggers. Okay. Remember, he's only 7 years old. And usually the kids between that age and maybe 12, 13, and sometimes 14, would wind up not only being corpse collectors, but also diggers. And the digging, if they could get outside of the wall, would be used as tunnels to smuggle food in exchange for giving other things to the Polish resistance people on the other side of the wall. Okay. So I hope you're getting kind of a picture of what younger people did in such an environment. Next slide. Oh, I want to share this with you. I'm sorry, the pointer doesn't work on this type of screen. If you look at the yellow space, that's kind of the geography of the Warsaw Ghetto. And if you'll notice, the green stuff are mostly cemeteries. So when the people inside were tunneling, trying to make tunnels, they tried to tunnel under the walls to get to the cemeteries, primarily to the cemeteries. And the reason for that was that the German military patrols infrequently patrolled the cemeteries. So anyway, the thinking was, here is a higher probability of getting out of the camp without being spotted by the perpetrators out there. So basically, there was a wall all the way around, and they tried to dig under the wall to get to the cemeteries. And that's where smuggling, the tunneling occurred most frequently to get outside, and that's where the smuggling to bring in food in exchange for other things maybe people had, like clothes, etc., inside. So that was one way to try to stay alive and potentially escape. Let's try the next one. Okay. The Gingolds and many other families tried that route through the tunnels and would come up into the cemeteries by tombstones. And remember, I mentioned to you the German patrols didn't frequent the cemeteries. So, they took chances as to when they could come up by the tombstones to try to escape. Okay. And the families, and not just Gingolds, but other families, did the same thing, and then they dispersed based on their best gut level feelings, or if they had knowledge a little bit. Remember, I mentioned my dad was quote educated. He went up to the 4th grade, and so he knew a little bit about geography and knew relatively well what direction we needed to go. Okay. So anyway, we headed towards the Soviet Union area. Oh, by the way, just as a point of time, we escaped just before this picture happened. And this was a total destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto. But prior to that destruction, 260,000 Jewish people from the ghetto were transported to killing camps. There were about 80,000 left, and basically that's when you had what you call the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, mostly by about 700-800 young people, usually older teenagers and people under the age of 25. But once the Germans were able to either eliminate that 80,000 inside the ghetto, they were basically decided, since we shipped out almost all of the Jewish people to concentration camps or killing camps, we'll destroy the ghetto so there's no evidence that it existed. And that's a picture of it. Okay, let's move on. Oh, this is one of the slides that out of position here. I want to reintroduce you to some other Gingolds that played an important role in our survival. The woman on the left, she was a teenager, about 16, 17 at that time. The guy in the middle was my uncle, who was about 21, 22. And my mean-looking dad on the right. And I don't remember how old he was at that time. I guess I could figure it out. All three of them, including my mom and my brother, played a role in my being here today. Thank goodness. Okay, next one. We traveled pretty much at night. And my uncle wound up being the scout because he was a pretty tough guy physically. And what he would do is go in advance of the rest of the Gingolds to different farms and see if the farmers would help us, mostly with food and shelter at night, to help us survive. And of course, the reason he went ahead as a scout is some farmers were willing to help, others were not. And there were a lot of reasons for both, which we probably don't know. But anyway, the farmers that did help, we sometimes, well, there's a term that the Jewish people use for those farmers, and it's a very nice term, and that's kind of a combination of courageous and morally right people. Anyway, if my uncle encountered any problems at farmers, and the reason the problems might have been were the farmers were not too happy with Jews, they would try to hold them and turn them over to the Nazis. And like I indicated to you, he was a pretty hardy soul, so in most cases he could fight off old farmers and escape. So we had a mix of good and bad experiences with farmers, and again, we don't have the time to talk about this, but you get the gist, you know. And the reason some farmers didn't want to help is because if the Nazis determined that they were helping Jews, they would be treated like a Jew. And in most cases, it was dying. Okay. That's the term I was looking for, the righteous. Okay, let's move on. Oh, and by the way, those are my observations. These are some of the skills, functions, attitudes I jotted down of righteous people. Now, it's not applicable just to the Holocaust or the Second World War. It's applicable today. When you have these characteristics and traits, you're in a category that regards humanity as important. For whatever belief that you have and whatever age that you're at. So those are pretty good traits to build on at any age when it's appropriate. Let's go on. Okay, we traveled for nearly a month going through the woods, farmers, farm to farm, until we reached the Russian military encampment. And fortunate for all of the Jewish people that were able to do that, Russia and Germany were at war. Their non-aggression treaty was broken by the Germans because the Germans were planning to invade Russia as well. At that point in time, the Gingolds were loaded on trucks, just like other people that were, so we weren't the only ones, there were thousands of people doing the same thing that we were trying to do. And these trucks happened to be Russian trucks this time, unlike the previous experience of German trucks. And these trucks took us to trains. Let's go to the next slide. From my aunt and uncle, Chava and Brian. So we didn't know where they went to because they were on separate trains. And these trains took us to northern Siberia, to the lumber camps that were used as part of the Russian or Soviet Union war effort. And the reason I show you this slide is that that's what the trains look like that had all of these displaced people going to Siberian lumber camps. The other thing I want to mention here, this is my first memory as a child. Now, these boxcars, unlike the German boxcars, had mattresses, had straw or hay, had food in them, and had ways to warm the people that were inside the boxcars as they traveled to northern Siberia. So, two memories I have as a young child. I was about 3 years of age. And I don't know why I have these memories. I have other ones a little older, but one memory was these trains stopped periodically to let people out so they could move around a bit, go to the bathroom, whatever. But my memory was getting out of the boxcar and jumping into the snow and playing like a 3-year-old would play in the snow with other 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. Play, play, play. I didn't know the hardships associated with what was going on right here. Okay. The other thing I remember, and I have no idea why I remember that, was that the Russian soldiers would speak Russian and try to, using visual cues, tell you what needed to be done, is that all of them had rifles just like the German soldiers had. And the thing I remember, and like I said, I don't know why, is that the Russian soldiers had their rifles pointed into the ground when they carried them. The German soldiers always pointed the rifles at people. That's the only thing. And of course, one basically says, I don't want to kill you. The other one basically says, maybe I'll harm you. I don't know why I remembered that as a young child, but that's strange. Anyway, so if you could go to the next slide. This is an example of a boxcar. Next slide. This is the inside of a boxcar that's just plain without any things to help people. Next one. This is a picture of a lumber camp. I don't know if that's the one we were. I wasn't able to research enough to find out which lumber camp that we were in Siberia. Let's go to the next. Here's another one. All of the adults were required to work in the lumber mills, including parents that had young children. And the kids were on their own. So the older kids took care of the younger kids. Okay. Next slide. This is just a sketch of maybe one of the lumber camps, I don't know which. The housing that was provided, or the barracks that was provided, was usually for 4 families. And the visual separation would be sheets between these 4 families. So you had a visual separation, but everybody lived in the same hut or building. And as you can see, I think whoever did this graphically, you can see the snow drifts The snow drifts were anywhere from about 6 to 9 feet to 14, 16 feet sometimes, as high as a building and sometimes higher. Okay. The other factor about Siberia, at least where we were, is there's only 1 month out of the year that's above freezing. Okay? So, and the reason I mention that to you is there was no effort of any of the displaced people to try to escape from the Siberia work camps. And it was pretty simple. One, of all of this cold weather and the snow. The second, the bears were phenomenal out there. People would be good feed for them. The Russian, they had very few Russian soldiers at these camps, so you could escape if you wanted to, if you were willing to figure out how you're going to deal with the cold weather and the wildlife in the woods. So the idea of escaping was not on the cards for anybody really. Okay, that's just a depiction. Next slide. Okay. We were in the lumber camp a little less than a year when what they would do is rotate families out of them. We were let go. We were released from the lumber camps. And by the way, when people worked at the lumber camps, they were well fed, well taken care of. And they also got paid. I don't know how much, or probably in Russian dollars of some kind. Anyway, just to give you, as I mentioned to you before, all of the adults were expected to work in the lumber camps. And the older kids would take care of the younger kids. So here was my brother, who was, at that point in time about, 9, so I don't remember the dates, I don't keep track that much. So he wound up taking care of me and other little kids right inside the building. So the younger kids became the students of the older kids. So the older kids were the tutors and the teachers. And when I say older kids, they were usually kids your age and younger. Okay? And one of the things that I remember again is that my brother would take sawdust, because we had a lot of sawdust, it was a lumber mill, and put that sawdust on the floor and use a stick and try to teach the younger kids, including me, different forms, shapes, whatever came to his mind to try to teach. So, here you have a 9, 10-year-old trying to teach 3 and 4-year-olds, okay? Using sawdust and sticks, and sometimes there were papers available, crumbled papers that were used not only to throw at each other, but also for try to teach people in terms of different skills. So in my mind, I mean, you probably are not familiar with the term etch and sketch, but that was kind of in my mind, the early etch and sketch. Sorry to have you leave. Thanks for coming. Okay. Anyway, so these older kids came up with their own ideas on how to try to interact. I call it education, but just to keep the whole, each household in some semblance of civility and order, I guess. Let me just take a let's go to the next slide. These were some other efforts. Let's move on. Um, Excuse me. This is a picture, the only picture that we have from that time, in the Russian lumber camp. As you can see, I'm the little one here, and the big one is my brother. We're in pretty good physical shape. We're well dressed. So to us as kids, that was no problem at that point in time. Let's go to the next slide. As I told you before, the lumber camp turnover is about once a year. The Soviet Union provided papers to the people that were leaving the lumber camps so they could travel through Russia without too much problem. And so one of the first things that we did was try to get to other parts of Russia that were a little warmer. And eventually try to figure out if any of our other relatives were still alive. So we had a lot of adventure trying to go back to other parts of the world. So for a long time we wound up being in a place called Kazakhstan. Let's do the next slide. And we were in Kazakhstan probably about 2.5 years. And in order to survive there, my dad was able to get a job working in a military factory producing, I think, boots or something like that. And my mom wound up having a table and be a vendor, if you will, in open markets where she could exchange goods, do trades with others. And she became very good at it. Just as a point of information, all of the Gingolds learned multiple languages. And I call them survival languages. In other words, they learned as quickly as they could the language in the country or area that they were in. So as an example, my dad was able to speak German, Polish, Russian, English, a little bit of English, and Yiddish. My mother was pretty close to that. She was able to speak only about 3 languages. So all of us tried to learn words and phrases that helped our survival. None of us, with the exception of my dad, who was educated to the 4th grade, picked up the languages where he could write and read them. None of us could do that. Okay, so he was kind of our leader, if you will, figuratively and realistically. Anyway, around early 1944, my dad was picked up by the police and he was put in jail, in prison. So my mom had 2 children that she was taking care of while my dad was in prison. And interestingly enough, a relatively short time after he was in prison, he located us. He was in prison maybe about 8-9 months. And that's one of the things that was always curious. So one day I asked him, aside from his ability to locate us in Kazakhstan, why did they let you out of prison? And he said, I have to believe that, is that they had nothing on record for him as to why he was there. And they couldn't figure out why he was in prison. And he said the same thing, that he didn't know why he was in prison, other than possibly that he was a Jew in Kazakhstan. Because again, a lot of scapegoating, discrimination, etc. was carried over in Kazakhstan towards the Jews as well. So anyway, he found us, and once we were able to leave Kazakhstan, which was kind of next slide, was kind of when the war ended, which was around May, early May. And we received Russian papers that would allow us to leave Russia. And based on the rumor mill and my dad's geographic savvy and whatever else was available, we headed back to Poland to see if we could find any living relatives after the war, and we didn't find any. So as part of the rumor mill, one of the things that was always communicated, that after the war, the city of Berlin, the capital of Germany, was kind of the headquarters for the Allied forces. And when I say Allied forces, I apologize if I'm giving you a geography lesson here. Consisted of England, France, United States, and Russia. And they all divided the city of Berlin, which was the capital of Berlin, of Germany, into sectors. And the rumor mill, as we were fleeing or getting to Poland, was that if you ever can get to Berlin, to the American sector, they have a lot of potential help for refugees from the war. So that was a driving goal. Once we found out that we didn't have any remaining living relatives in Warsaw, we made a trek towards Berlin, Germany. Once we were in Berlin, if you can go to the next slide. It took a while to hitchhike, and we had to do all kinds of crazy things to survive. My brother and I became pretty good at doing garbage dump diving to get items that could be used by the Gingolds. One time, we dived into garbage trucks, and we were in the garbage trucks, and the garbage trucks started moving away somewhere. So it was escape from a garbage truck that saved us potentially. But anyway, let's move on. Okay, once we're in Berlin, we did all kinds of funny things, some legal and some illegal things to get to Berlin. We get to Berlin, let's do the next slide. This is a picture of my older brother and me. As you can see, we're in pretty good shape now. We're in the American sector of Berlin, so they fed us well. That's where I was introduced first to candy bars. The American soldiers, for some reason, always had candy bars with them, and they would give those to kids very easily, especially when you could say hello to an American. So anyway, we were very well taken care of, and we had all kinds of adventures in Berlin, of which we don't have the time to talk about. Some good, some not so good. But anyway, that's kind of a picture that we have. Next slide. Okay.
You have about 20 minutes left,
Okay.
so I'll let you know.
I want to leave some time, so I'll wrap this up in about 5 minutes because I want to give you time to ask questions, and I'll do the best I can to try to answer them for you. Okay, well, anyway, we wound up in Berlin, and Berlin was a distribution center for refugees, where they would parcel them out to other locations. And from Berlin, we wound up going to a place called Fernwald, which was what is called a displaced persons camp. There were about 20 some of those for post-war refugees. This one was one of the larger ones, and it had about 5,000 people in it. And it was controlled by the American military forces. But over time, they turned over the governance of that DP camp to the Jewish people residing in that camp. We were in that camp for 6 years, the refugee camp. And it was a pretty good camp. My younger brother was born about a year after the war. So when it was a very productive childbirth camp. Within a year after the war, 250 families gave birth in this camp of less than 5,000. So that was a very high birth rate. I think, in adult groups you would say, well, they're making up for lost time, kind of thing. But anyway, just as a point, the reason I don't talk about Jacob is he was my younger brother, and he died when he was 26, so he was in the United States, and he died playing basketball. He was a basketball player. He just keeled over of a cardiac attack. But anyway, okay, let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Just the irony of it, this is a layout of the DP camp that we were in. And if you notice, if you can see it, all the streets are named after states, American states. And the whole irony, the reason I show this, is you never know when things pop up, is that the Gingolds lived on 14 Illinois Street. Can you imagine the chance of coming to Illinois? Okay, let's move on. This is just a picture of the camp. It was very well maintained. The Jewish people inside the camp maintained everything. The American soldiers controlled the governance of the camp. Next. This is a picture of kids in that camp. Next. Oh, I want to point this out to you. One of the first things that the camps did, this is prior to internet and all of that kind of stuff, is that they would publish newspapers. And the newspaper was the main vehicle of communication, not only between camps, but also within the camps. And what they would do in every newspaper across all of the camps is put in pictures of children that were orphans or assumed orphans to see if anybody would recognize them, whether it was friend or relative, and claim them actually. So this is just an example. They would have their picture and their name throughout these newspapers. Okay, next. This is just a document that says Bill Gingold is leaving. Next. This is a picture of about a year before we were to be shipped out. Next. This is a picture of the actual boat that the Gingolds came to the United States on. It's a military transport. And I just want to show you, other than a lot of seasickness, the kids had a whale of a time on the boat playing, again, no school. And the adults wound up doing maintenance, like they would paint the inside and outside of the boat. So one of the memories I have is my dad on some kind of rig. As this boat is going through the water, he's painting the outside of the boat. Plus other people that did the same thing. Okay, next. This is just a manifest that says all the Gingolds on the bottom are arriving in New York. Next. This is Ellis Island. That's where most immigrants came to once they passed the Statue of Liberty. Next. We were sent to Milwaukee, Wisconsin after Ellis Island. And the reason was pretty simple. My parents, as I told you, were basically unskilled laborers. And Milwaukee had a real booming manufacturing business at that time. So it was easy for them to find jobs. So my dad wound up working in a steel mill, and my mom wound up working in a bakery. And they worked there until they died, basically, or retired, if you will. The next slide. This is me about your age in Milwaukee. It was a little cold at that time. Okay, next. Oh, this I want to share with you. When I came to the United States, and I'm making this personal at this point, I was about your age, maybe a little younger, and I never went to school, so I couldn't read or write. I could do some of the survival languages, like I told you. I could understand Russian, Polish, German. I could speak Yiddish. I knew a little bit of Hebrew, etc. But I never went to school. So when we came to Milwaukee, one of the social service agencies gave us a tutor. My brother was not interested. He was too old, he felt. He wanted to go out to work. But I was very interested in trying to learn English. And so this tutor met with me about once or twice a week and tried to teach me initially the ABCs, etc. So I started from scratch. But the times I wasn't with the tutor, I did a couple of different things on my own. I was able to get some money from my parents. They were working now. And I would pack myself a lunch. I would take the bus in Milwaukee and go downtown. That's where they had all the movie theaters. And I would go to the movies starting about 11 in the morning. And these movies recycled until they closed late at night. And I would sit there for 4 or 6 hours at a time with the movies that I watched. were cowboy movies. So I picked up some of the cowboy language patterns. I hope I don't have them now, but anyway, at that time I did. Okay, the reason I'm showing you these slides, these were the dominant cowboys, movie cowboys at that time. And the one I want to call your particular attention is the bottom picture, the guy in the middle. He was Hopalong Cassidy. He was the king of the cowboys at that time. His stage name was William Boyd. And the reason I'm bringing it up to you, when I turned 18, I went and applied for United States citizenship. And one of the problems the immigration judge had was pronouncing my first name, Baruch, which means bless you or be blessed. So he said, after he'd had a couple of tries, would you like an American name? And of course, I remembered the king of the cowboys. His stage name was William Boyd. So I said, William would be a great name for me. So that's how I got my name. First name, anyway. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll wrap it up, okay? The other thing is when we were moved to Milwaukee, our family wound up living in the ghetto of Milwaukee. We were one of the few white families in an all-black community. But we were very fortunate. We lived next to a church that had a thrift store, and we would shop there. My family would shop there. And one of the things for me as a kid, I would look at comic books a lot. And at one point, the salesperson in this thrift store said, why don't you take some of them home? So that became my textbook during the summer, is reading a lot of comic books or trying to read. And what I would do, I guess these are called what? Novels now? What is the term that's...
Graphic novels.
Graphic novels. At that time they were called something else, okay? But anyway, as people speak, they have these little clouds over them with a little arrow. And that's where I started picking up words, trying to relate to the expression of the character that it was pointing to. So that was another learning thing. And the final one was when I started school in junior high at that time, I wound up having a couple of good friends that were both black. Remember, we lived in a pretty dominant black community. So they became my tutors. So I picked up some of their language patterns. Anyway, the reason I want to mention these two guys, and ironically I still remember their names. One was Ben Ford, who was a big, husky kid. And the other one was Kenny Tatum, who was a squirrely runt and was always in motion. Whatever he did it fast. His movements were always fast. He talked fast. Everything was fast about him. Anyway, they wound up not only being my tutors, but they also wound up, to some extent, being my protectors, because I was bullied a lot, because I couldn't speak English. And here I was in a total different environment. So they prevented a lot of bullying in terms of my living there. So anyway, I want to just tell you a quick story about the two. When we wound up finishing junior high, we all separated and went to different high schools. So we lost track of each other. But when I was a little older, I was kind of curious to find out what happened to my best friends at that junction. Anyway, I found out that Ben Ford, the big guy, was in prison. I didn't know for what. And the squirrely little guy was, I guess, not squirrely anymore, got 2 degrees in engineering from Marquette University and was on the Olympic track team with the United States. So you kind of get a gist where you have kids in one environment, yet they wound up having different roles, different scenarios, but you never know all the reasons why. But anyway, let's go to the next slides. That's my parents in the 70s. Next. I'll leave a couple of books with you, which, if any of you are interested, is really the story of the Gingolds, particularly my older brother, which I glossed over because he had contributed so much to our survival. So let me stop here and try to answer as many questions as I can in the few minutes that we have left. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. You'll have to talk real loud. I'm hard of hearing.
How tall were you in junior high?
I'm sorry?
How tall were you in junior high?
Well, I'll have to guess there. I was about, stand up. I was about your height. I was a little chubbier than you, but about your height, okay? Yes,
Did you start in 7th grade or 8th grade?
7th grade. And it was challenging because I didn't know how to read or write English, but I had some superb teachers. Yes,
Do you still remember any of the languages that you
I'm sorry.
Do you remember any of the languages that you learned?
Yeah, a little bit, not to any great extent. I still remember German. I remember a little bit of Russian and Polish. I'm working on my English. And I'm very fluent in Yiddish, because that's a language that the Jews used to talk with each other, in most cases. Yes, yes.
How long did it take for you to learn how to read and write?
Well, I'm still working on it. I would say probably by the time I got to high school, I was able to do okay. I still struggled with English writing, and I even struggled in early years of college with college English writing requirements. So it took a few years to maybe get to the point where I communicate different ways currently. Yes, Ben? I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Can you talk a little louder?
What type of struggles did you have whenever you started 7th grade?
Well, I mentioned to you I was bullied a lot, but I had a couple of good buddies that intervened pretty well. Learning the language was frustrating, but I had some fantastic teachers that were aware of my problems and helped me very specifically. I had struggles in terms of just being a young teenager, growing up with all of the struggles that all of you as young people have. Yes.
When you came to America, did you ever meet anyone else that was a survivor from the Holocaust?
Yeah, almost all of the people on the boat that we were on were Holocaust survivors when we came to the United States.